Glancing at the monitor, Mr. Kinzinger, followed by Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. We're all kind of exhausted of this conflict, and nobody's more exhausted than the Syrian people. And the problem is, I think, we sometimes need to be reminded of what's really going on. You know, the media will cover when there's a picture of a kid in the back of an ambulance, and that gets about a week or two of attention. And then it gets overtaken by whatever drama is going on here that really, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't matter. And people just get bogged down in that. We have a candidate for U.S. president that still is repeating Putin's talking points that Bashar al Asaad never even used chemical weapons. And there are a group of people out there that actually believe that. As they read certain websites, and this person's running for president, and therefore they must have great knowledge. This is a bipartisan failure. This was a failure of the last administration in stopping Russia from even being involved in Syria in the first place, from the red line situation, from saying good words with no action, and it's been a failure of this administration, from making claims that we need to be out of everywhere in the Middle East, bring everybody home, let the world burn, from the view of, you know, 2 different proclamations that we're leaving Syria, only to confuse our allies and excite our enemies, a lack of articulation of what our interest is in Syria and the reason that it matters to us. It's not just because we see a picture of a kid in the back of an ambulance and we feel bad, but it's because it is in the United States' interest not to cede that ground to Russia, to Iran, and to allow that evil to exist. You know, President Clinton once said his greatest regret was inaction in Rwanda. And I think this generation will look back and say our greatest regret is inaction in Syria, not just because of the human toll, which is devastating, but because of the politics that will follow here. As Ms. Cavarella said, you know, we have basically every, we'll call it an empire, but every large nation that has some presence in Syria right now. And we see with the exchange of fire between Turkey and Russia that we're always on the verge of some major conflict. And yet the world is asleep at the switch. You know who else bears a lot of blame? Is the entire continent of Europe that is feeling the effects of this and doing nothing and looking to the United States to solve all the problems. I'm for a strong U.S. foreign policy, but I also think our allies need to have some skin in the game as well. We have more outrage here sometimes over what's going on in Yemen than we do over the 500,000 people that are dead in Syria. The United States accidentally bombs a hospital in Afghanistan, and it's all over the news for 2 weeks. We do a debrief in the military. We find out everything that went wrong. We apologize, as we should. And every day, Russia, backed by Iran and backing the Assad regime, bomb hospitals, and nobody cares. And people talk about maybe we need to talk with Russia. Maybe we need to be friends with them. That's the problem we see in Syria. And it would have been much easier to intervene earlier. But I'll tell you, our worst case scenarios of Syria with intervention, that we said if we intervene, look at what happened in Libya. Libya is far better off than Syria, by the way. But everything we said was the worst case scenario has actually been tripled by inaction. And by the way, it's only going to get worse. This does not burn itself out. It's a fire in an apartment complex, not a fire in a house out in the country. It will catch and it will spread. Ms. Caffarella, this is obviously the worst humanitarian crisis since the start of this conflict. What would you say was the turning point in this conflict, and how did we let it get so bad?
Thank you. It's an excellent question. In my view, there have been multiple turning points. We're entering our 10th year of the war. But I would point to the Russian intervention in 2015. But I think the actual turning point was a passive decision that we made to cede Syria to the Russians. There was no reason, actually, we needed to do that. We continue to act like the Russians are 10 feet tall, even though the Russian commitment to Syria is actually quite limited, and Russian capabilities are actually far, far smaller than the Russians claim and that the world seems to see. The Turks are demonstrating, actually, the limits of Russia's leverage and military capability in Syria through the Turkish campaign in Idlib, which has imposed costs on the regime, but also on the Russians, because Turkey has attacked Russian proxy forces and destroyed Russian-provided air defense systems. So in my view, it is our inaction, actually, that was the turning point, and especially with respect to the Russians. We're ceding an entire theater to a man, Putin, that considers the United States his top enemy. We're defeating ourselves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back, but I do want to make a quick comment in closing, if you give me leverage. Every time the Russians come up to a red line and they are pushed back, we think of when we killed the Wagner Group folks in Syria, and every time, and Turkey, as Ms. Caffarella mentioned very well, they back off. Putin will advance as far until he hits a brick wall. The problem is we haven't put too many brick walls in front of him. So, sorry, I had more questions for all you guys, but we have limited time. I thank you all for being here, and Mr. Chairman, I'll be back.
Thank you, Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Malinowski, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.